Belhaven in the autumn of 1881 felt like a place holding its breath. The mountains pressed in on all sides, their slopes heavy with pine that never seemed to sway even in wind. The air hung still. The chimneys smoked in thin, reluctant lines, and footsteps on the lone cobblestone street carried farther than they should have. The people spoke softly not from shyness, but because anything louder seemed to risk breaking something fragile and unseen. At the far end of the street, where the stones met a patch of pale dirt, stood the new municipal morgue, a white brick building with narrow windows and a single brass door. It was an odd addition for such a small town, especially one where death had always been handled by the church, but the townsfolk had accepted it without question, the way one accepts bad weather. The man who had built it, Thaddeus Vane, was not a doctor nor an undertaker, nor even a man known for any particular trade. He had arrived in Belhaven 6 months prior, his papers in order, his manner soft and careful, and his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who seemed to know what others did not. He told the mayor that the future demanded more modern care for the dead, hygienic, private, and efficient. He promised the building would serve not only as a morgue but as a kind of scientific preservation facility, though he never explained for what purpose. What struck people most was the smell. From the first week, a faint sweetness drifted from the morgue into the street, pleasant at first like lilacs in spring, but persistent in a way that clung to hair and clothes. On damp mornings, the scent seemed to grow thicker, almost syrupy, leaving a taste in the mouth. The mayor assured everyone it was simply Vane's method of keeping the air pure around the dead. But in a town where burials were rare and no coffins were seen leaving the building, the perfume began to feel like a mask, one meant to cover something else. Children dared each other to touch the morgue's brass door, swearing that it was always warm, even in frost. Old Mrs. Hargreave, who lived across the street, told her sister she'd never once seen a delivery wagon bring supplies, yet the lights inside never went out. At night, from her upper window, she sometimes glimpsed a dim glow shifting within, as if someone were walking the rooms with a covered lantern, pausing for long minutes at unseen tables. Vane himself seemed untouched by the place's strange aura. He walked the town each morning with a small satchel, exchanging polite greetings, offering perfumed handkerchiefs to those who coughed, and inquiring after the sick in a way that felt almost tender. People said he never ate in public, never took a drink in the tavern, and never lingered in the company of others. He was courteous without warmth, precise without urgency, as if every movement were measured to waste no energy at all. No one could recall hearing him laugh. The children said his eyes didn't blink enough, though when they did, they closed slowly like a lizard in sunlight. The stillness of Belhaven seemed to deepen after the morgue's arrival. The river slowed under a film of early frost, and the sound of wagon wheels on stone became rare. The townsfolk found themselves keeping indoors more, speaking less, as though the air itself discouraged too much activity. And always the perfume was there, lingering at the edge of every breath, creeping into homes through shutters, seeping into church pews and settling into the fabric of winter coats. No one spoke openly of it, but more than one housewife quietly boiled her laundry twice, swearing the scent would not wash out. In those months, no funerals were held, No tolling of the church bell, no procession to the cemetery, no fresh graves dug into the hill. When asked, Vane would explain with a mild smile that all necessary arrangements had been handled discreetly to spare families grief. It was a kindness, he said, to take such burdens upon himself. People nodded because there was nothing else to do, but they began locking their doors at night, a habit foreign to the town before his arrival. Dogs that wandered near the morgue often did not return. The few that did were quieter afterward, their movements slow as though something had drained the spring from their limbs. By the end of autumn, the cobblestone street was empty most nights, and the town's hush had become more than the absence of noise. It was a hush with weight, a hush that felt as though it were listening back. The morgue stood at its end like a sentinel, white bricks catching the moonlight, the faint sweetness curling from its seams. In that quiet, Belhaven seemed less like a town and more like a place waiting. For what? No one dared to ask aloud. The first snow fell in early December, muffling what little sound remained, and in that heavy silence the scent of perfume grew stronger still, as though the cold itself carried it farther. And somewhere behind the brass door, Thaddeus Vane kept his work, patient and unhurried, as if the whole town were already inside his ledger, each name marked for a season yet to come. Thaddeus Vane moved through Belhaven like a man untouched by the world's grime. His clothes were always immaculate. Pale linen coats that never seemed to crease, boots without a trace of dust, gloves that held no scent of sweat or soil. His voice was low and measured, the kind of tone that calmed even the most anxious widow when he inquired after her health. He carried himself with the stillness of someone who had no need to hurry because time itself seemed to obey him. In the market he would pause to hand a shopkeeper a vial of rose water, explaining that it kept illness from clinging to the skin. To coughing children he offered small perfumed handkerchiefs with patterns stitched so finely they looked like lace. He told them it was a kindness, a token of health, but in truth each one was marked by his own hidden code, a private symbol woven into the corner, identifying which household he had already studied, which bodies he had measured in his mind for future work. Beneath the softness of his manner lay an exacting obsession. He had learned long ago that the world's revulsion toward death was merely ignorance, a child's fear of the dark. To Vane, the moment a body's breath left it was not an ending but a release, a quiet unlocking of the vessel, revealing something he considered far more useful than the life it once held. He saw no tragedy in it, the warmth fading from skin, the weight shifting inside as muscles relaxed, the stillness setting in like frost. These were not signs of loss, but opportunities for precision. He had trained himself to notice the subtle changes others overlooked, the instant when the pulse's absence was not yet visible to the untrained eye, but had already transformed the body into what he called raw material. In his private thinking, this was the truest state of a human being, stripped of the illusions of personality, of noise, of all the wasted gestures of the living. His fascination was not born from rage, nor from any desperate hunger for power. It was something colder, a devotion to order. He believed that decay left unchecked was an insult to creation. In his youth he had watched common burials and been disgusted by the clumsy way the dead were handled, as though they were refused to be hidden from sight. In Belhaven, he promised himself that nothing would rot without purpose, nothing would be lost to the blind cruelty of time. He approached each future death with the same care a craftsman might give to selecting fine wood, noting the texture of skin, the symmetry of the face, the way bones sat beneath the flesh. He imagined what could be preserved, what could be reshaped, and what might serve a function beyond the living. Vane's laboratory within the morgue was arranged with a symmetry that mirrored his mind. Every instrument had its exact place. Every vial was labeled in his own neat script, each cloth cover drawn perfectly over whatever lay beneath. He polished metal tools until they reflected light like mirrors, not out of vanity, but because he believed the dead deserved a certain purity. The smell of his concoctions, oils, distillations, and tinctures extracted from things the living would not touch, blended into the perfume that drifted through the street. The scent for him was not merely to mask decay. It was a signal, an invisible calling card marking the air as his domain. When he walked among the townsfolk, he often studied their movements with the same patience others reserved for reading. A butcher's broad hands, a seamstress's delicate fingers, an old man's clouded eyes, all were noted and remembered. In their laughter and arguments and weary sighs, he saw only fleeting currents above a deeper stillness that would one day claim them. He did not hate them. He did not even wish them harm in the way the law would understand. In his mind, they were all works in progress, unaware of the refinement awaiting them when their noise had quieted. His calm smile, his courteous bows, the gentle press of a perfumed handkerchief into a palm. These were his ways of greeting not the person before him, but the form they would take after. And so Belhaven embraced him, never knowing that every act of civility was also an act of quiet possession. Vane moved through their days like a shadow in white, gathering the living not as friends or neighbors, but as future pieces of a design only he could see. Illness still came to Belhaven. Accidents on the frozen river still claimed their share. Old men still died in their sleep, and infants still slipped away in the night. Yet no funeral processions wound through the cobblestone street, and no heavy carts carried the dead up to the hillside cemetery. Every body without exception was taken to Thaddeus Vane's morgue, and from that point onward it seemed to vanish. The townsfolk, when they dared to ask, received the same answer. His methods were discreet. His purpose to spare the grieving from the ugliness of final arrangements. He told them the remains were prepared quickly and with dignity, sent away by night to their resting places. His voice made it sound like mercy. But in truth, no whole corpse ever left his possession. Within the morgue's pale brick walls, Vane had arranged the space as a kind of archive, though one not meant for the living to see. Behind the public room, where a polished counter and a register gave the impression of bureaucracy, there lay the inner chambers. Here the air was colder, and the sweet perfume that drifted through town was heavier, almost clinging to the tongue. Along the walls, deep drawers slid open on oiled rails, each lined with black velvet. Inside were not bodies but carefully chosen fragments, a row of hands arranged by size, a set of ribs fanned like pages in a book, a jawbone polished until it shone. Nothing was left in the crude disorder of a grave. Every piece was positioned with deliberate care, angled and balanced as though for an unseen audience. For Vane, this was not grotesque work but a pursuit of order. A complete corpse was wasteful, unrefined, a raw block of material not yet shaped into its purpose. The living had no understanding of how much beauty lay beneath their skin. How many perfect forms were hidden in the machinery of their own bodies. He saw the whole as flawed, but the parts, a wrist joint, a section of spine, the delicate arc of a collarbone, as pure in their geometry. Each was catalogued in his mind, cross-referenced against the ledger of names he kept under lock, awaiting some unknown completion. The drawers were not graves nor trophies, but components in a design that only he could see in full. And so the morgue never smelled of rot, never echoed with grief. It was a place of quiet industry where the dead were not laid to rest but taken apart, their usefulness preserved. No one in Belhaven imagined that their missing fathers, wives, and children were still inside, scattered across compartments, transformed into pieces that no longer resembled the people they had been. From the street, the white building stood as silent as the day it was built, its brass door reflecting the dull light of winter, while inside, Vane's drawers waited to be filled, one careful piece at a time. Beneath the polished oak counter in the front room of the morgue, where most visitors assumed he kept receipts or municipal records, Thaddeus Vane guarded the only document he truly valued. It was a thick leather-bound ledger, the hide darkened and smooth from years of use. The lock was small but strong, the kind used for travel chests rather than books, and it bore no key on his person. Inside, the pages did not hold the careful columns of names, dates, and causes of death expected in a morgue registry. Instead, each page displayed a single face, sketched in pencil with almost unsettling precision. These were not drawn from the lifeless, but from memory and observation, each detail refined until the eyes stared back from the paper with the quiet spark of life still in them. Beneath every portrait was a set of marks, strange symbols that bore no resemblance to any known language, accompanied by a number written in his narrow, precise hand. These numbers were not ages nor dates of birth, but intervals, months, seasons, in some cases mere weeks. Vane's ledger was not a record of those who had died. It was a map of those who had not yet. To him, the living were not accidents waiting to happen or the unfortunate victims of illness. They were crops in a field, each on a path toward a particular moment when they would be ready for his work. He called it ripening in the privacy of his thoughts, not with cruelty, but with the quiet respect of a gardener speaking of harvest. The symbols beside each face represented the manner in which they should be taken, a code he had built over years, part ritual and part design. Some symbols signaled that only a certain part of the body was worth claiming. Others meant that the death itself needed to occur in a particular way. An accident on the river, a sudden illness, a fall from height. Each one chosen not for concealment, but because the result would yield the form he desired. He had begun the ledger years before arriving in Belhaven, carrying it across towns and cities like a craftsman transporting his tools. But here, in this mountain town with its slow rhythms and small population, the work became more deliberate. He could watch his subjects for months without interference, noting changes in health, gait, or temperament. An old fisherman with shoulders warped from years of rowing might be marked for his unusual spine. A young seamstress with long, steady fingers might be marked for the intricate structures in her hands. Children appeared in the book as well, their faces surrounded by symbols denoting fragility, not as weakness, but as an opportunity for preservation before the body grew and lost its symmetry. The ledger was not built in haste. Each edition was the result of long consideration, often months of silent watching. Vane recorded the way a subject's features altered in winter cold, how their skin tanned or freckled in summer, how sickness touched their eyes or left them untouched. He thought of these as studies necessary to know when the body's structure had reached the exact point where it should be claimed, before decay of age or accident could spoil it. There was no malice in these decisions, no rush to take what was not yet ready. The waiting was part of the craft. He felt the same satisfaction turning a key in the ledger's lock as another man might feel opening a fine bottle of wine. In his mind, the ledger was a promise, not to himself but to the bodies that would one day fill his drawers. He was offering them escape from the clumsy indifference of the grave, from worms and collapse and the slow humiliation of decay. In his care, they would be preserved at their most complete moment, not as people but as perfected forms. The townsfolk, in their ignorance, greeted him in the market or at church without realizing that their own faces stared back at him from those pages each night, waiting for their appointed hour. At times, when the street outside was empty and the perfume from his concoctions hung thick in the air, Vane would lay the ledger open on the counter and study the faces by lamplight. He would trace the lines of a jaw with his fingertip, not in affection, but in quiet calculation. He imagined the sound each body would make under his tools, the texture of skin giving way, the colors that would bloom beneath his blade. He thought of the spaces in his drawers that remained empty and which face would fill them next. He was never impatient. The work demanded that each piece arrive exactly as intended. To anyone who entered the morgue, the ledger was invisible, hidden behind the calm smile and pale linen. But in truth, it was the heartbeat of the building, the silent engine that drove every polite gesture, every inquiry after a neighbor's health, every handkerchief pressed into a palm. It was not death that Thaddeus Vane collected. It was inevitability bound in leather and waiting for its season. The fragrance that floated through Belhaven, soft as a whisper and stubborn as smoke, was not the product of flowers nor oils pressed from petals in some distant orchard. It was born in the morgue, coaxed into existence through a process Thaddeus Vane considered his most delicate craft. He had discovered years earlier that blood held a fleeting vapor in the moments before it thickened and stilled. A warmth that rose, invisibly carrying with it the faintest trace of the life that had just ended. To most, this vapor was nothing, gone before it could be noticed. To Vane, it was the truest part of a person, the invisible remnant that hovered in the air like a last confession. He built his work around capturing it. The process demanded precision. The body had to be opened within minutes, the vessels kept warm to draw the vapor upward. He would position wide glass funnels over the incisions, sealing the escaping breath into thin copper tubes that coiled through cold water. The vapor condensed into clear drops, each one trembling before sliding into a waiting vial. A single body, if handled with care, might yield no more than a spoonful. This was the heart of the scent, the part he called the soul's exhale. On its own, it was faint, almost nothing. A shadow of warmth touched with the sharp edge of iron. To preserve it, he would bind it to heavy oils rendered from seeds and roots, masking the metallic trace without losing the heat beneath. It took hours to coax the mixture into balance, turning what should have smelled like blood into something floral, familiar, and yet unplaceable. For Vane, the perfume was not a disguise but a possession. Every breath of it in the street meant that a piece of someone remained under his care, carried on the wind, inhaled unknowingly by the living. In his mind, this was not morbid, it was generosity. The dead, instead of vanishing into soil, became part of the air itself, touching those who walked past, lingering on their skin and hair. He imagined lovers smelling it on each other's clothes, parents breathing it in as they rocked their children to sleep, never knowing they were drawing someone else's last breath into their own lungs. He released the scent in measured waves, adjusting the vents in the morgue so that it drifted just enough to be noticed, but never enough to raise suspicion. Too much, and it would seem unnatural. Too little, and it would be wasted. Over time, the town grew accustomed to it, even comforted by it, like a familiar song heard in the distance. They believed it to be the mark of Vane's cleanliness, his commitment to dignity. Only he knew it was the opposite, not the absence of death, but its constant presence, invisible yet inescapable. And as winter deepened, the perfume clung longer in the still air, as though the souls he had bottled were reluctant to leave. The deaths began quietly, without alarm, as though the town itself had grown tired and chosen to lay certain people down. There were no screams in the night, no shattered windows, no signs of struggle. Only stillness. A farmer was found in his bed, his face calm, yet inside his skin his bones had been shifted, realigned in ways nature would never allow. His spine curved in a perfect arch, his ribs spaced evenly as though measured with a craftsman's caliper. A seamstress was discovered in her parlor, seated neatly in her chair, with her thimble still on her finger, her eyes closed as if caught mid-thought. Only when the undertaker's wife tried to wash her did they find her mouth sewn shut from the inside, the stitching so fine it could have been mistaken for delicate embroidery. There was no blood, no violence, only the unsettling suggestion that someone had treated the bodies not as remains but as raw materials. Vane's work was precise because to him it was not killing but correction. The living were flawed in ways the dead did not have to be. Their spines bent from work, their joints swollen, their faces weathered. He saw himself not as a taker of life, but as an artist given the chance to fix what nature had marred. Once the heart stopped, there was no rush. He could take the time to cut in straight, patient lines, to ease a bone from its seat and set it elsewhere, to adjust proportions until they felt right. Each movement of his hand was deliberate, part of a design that existed only in his mind, where beauty was not softness but symmetry. There was ritual in it too, though he would never have called it that. Before beginning, he would breathe slowly, counting each inhale until his pulse was steady. He would lay the tools out in strict order, from smallest to largest, like a soldier arranging weapons before battle. A basin of water was always placed at his right hand, though he never used it to wash the dead, only to rinse his fingers between adjustments, as though cleansing himself of each small imperfection before moving to the next. When the work was done, he left no outward wound, no hint of intrusion. as if the body had died in a perfect pose of its own accord. The town whispered of a strange sickness, something that stilled the heart without leaving a mark. They did not know they were looking for an illness that had no name, because it was not born from fever or rot, but from the careful hands of a man who believed the soul left behind an empty frame, and that a frame, once empty, could be improved. In the winter light, the body seemed peaceful. Only those who looked too long felt the unease creep in, the suspicion that peace had been arranged. Vane's hunger was not for chance, but for certainty. He favored lives that ran like clockwork. The man who sat by the same window at dawn with his pipe. The widow who wound her grandfather clock at precisely 8 each night. The mill hand who took the same path home through the elm-lined lane. Routines gave him a map, and a map meant control. He would follow them for weeks, memorizing not just their paths but their pauses, the small moments when they stood still long enough for shadows to settle around them. There was no thrill in the chase, no satisfaction in struggle. The true art lay in entering their world so quietly that even they did not know he had arrived. He moved like breath through an open door, often in the blackest hour when dreams still clung to the sleeping mind. His hands were steady, his tools arranged in a small roll of cloth he could fold back in a single motion. He worked not to spill blood, for blood was loud, but to unfasten the body from the inside. His methods were a study in impossible delicacy. A thin insertion, a gloved hand slipping between what was vital and what could be taken, leaving skin untouched and smooth as candle wax. Hearts, lungs, and livers were coaxed free in silence, their absence leaving behind a hollow warmth that would fade only with time. The cruelty was not in the act of removal, but in what came after. Vane took no pleasure in corpses that slumped immediately. He wanted them to rise, to move, to greet the day in ignorance of what was missing. To him, these hours, the hollowed hour, were the purest form of creation. He would stand in the street corner's shadow and watch as they opened shutters, greeted neighbors, lifted buckets from the well, all while carrying the weight of nothing inside them. Every step they took was a step closer to collapse, but they did not yet know it. This blindness was his gift to them and to himself. There was a precision to his timing. Too soon, and the body would fail before its performance was complete. Too late, and he risked losing the rare spectacle of watching a life go out mid-motion. He would track them in those final hours, his eyes measuring the slow stiffening of limbs, the faint sway as breath began to falter. Often the end came in ordinary places, a fall beside the hearth, a quiet slump against the market stall, a sudden stillness on a garden path. The witnesses would think it sudden, perhaps a stroke or fainting fit, never imagining the truth. That the heart had not been there to beat for hours, that the breath had been drawn by muscles alone, unaware of their own futility. For Vane, the beauty of it was not only in the death, but in the illusion of life prolonged beyond its rightful span. It was proof that the body could be reduced to a shell and still convince the world it was whole. He believed this proved something essential. That most of what people called life was nothing more than habit and movement, and that removing the core changed nothing until the final moment. And so he waited, always watching from a distance until the shell finally failed, and the truth revealed itself in a collapse so unremarkable it could be mistaken for rest. Only then would he turn away, already seeking the next life that could be emptied without knowing it. At the farthest end of Belhaven's morgue, behind a warped oak door with no keyhole, there was a chamber the town did not know existed. It was small, low-ceilinged, and lit by a single red glass lantern that hung from a chain above the center of the room. The light it cast was not warm, but oppressive, bleeding into every shadow and making the air itself feel heavier. In this place, the world beyond the walls seemed to vanish. The damp smell of stone mixed with something faintly metallic, something human. Against the back wall stood a row of upright iron vats, each rimmed with frost and breathing out thin ribbons of vapor that curled toward the lantern's glow. Inside each vat, suspended in thick, cold liquid, was a human figure, their faces pressed faintly against the fogged glass, lips parted as though to speak, chests rising and falling so slowly it was almost invisible. These were not corpses, not yet. They were what Vane called unfinished, lives paused in the borderland between breath and stillness. He had taken from them what he wanted, sometimes an organ, sometimes more, but had left just enough for them to remain alive in a way that mocked life itself. Their eyes sometimes fluttered open, pupils shrinking in the red haze, and they would look outward, not in recognition but in a dim awareness of presence. Vane believed this was when the human soul was most visible, stripped of pretension, stripped of thought, clinging only to the raw animal knowledge of its own end. He called these hours portraits, and he tended to them with the same precision a painter gives to light and shadow. The vats were his frames, the red lantern his brush. He would stand before them in silence, his breath steady, studying every twitch of a jaw, every subtle tremor that passed through limbs numbed by cold. In his mind, this was the truest record of mankind. Not in the laughter of youth, nor the beauty of health, but in the fragile, unfinished moment when the body still fought but had already lost. Time in the red lantern room was not measured by the clock, but by the slowing rhythm of each figure's breath. Sometimes they lingered for hours, swaying gently in the liquid as if the motion itself was a memory of life. Other times they stilled quickly, their final exhalation disappearing into the mist with no sound. When the breath was gone, Vane would drain the vat slowly, letting the figure settle into the bottom like a fallen statue. He did not remove them right away. He allowed the red light to rest on their faces for a while longer, as though the glow itself could preserve something invisible. Only when the lantern's oil ran low would he unlock the iron clasps, slide the body out, and prepare the vat for another. The red lantern room was not a place for storage. It was a place for witnessing, for holding a human being in the narrow, trembling space between life and death, and deciding exactly when the fall should come. To Vane, that power was not cruelty, it was art. And the lantern never went dark. The winter came down like a sentence on Belhaven, a cold so deep it silenced even the wind. Snow buried the roads until they ceased to exist, and the river, the town's slow, dependable artery, turned to a white slab beneath which nothing moved. The ice came early, hard and unyielding, sealing away the dark water that Vane had long relied upon. For years the river had been his silent accomplice, swallowing what could not be kept, carrying away the remnants of his work in its black current. Now it lay still, its frozen skin thick enough to bear a cart's weight, and the current beneath was trapped, useless to him. The town felt the season's grip in different ways. Supplies dwindled, hunger sharpened faces, and people began to vanish in quiet numbers that no one wanted to speak aloud. Doors were barred at night, but it changed nothing. Families woke to find a place at the table empty, a bed still warm but unoccupied. And with each passing week, the air in Belhaven thickened with a strange, sweet scent. Vane's perfume, once a faint, polite trace when he passed in the street, now heavy enough to cling to the air long after he was gone. It was not the crisp sweetness of winter flowers, but something warmer, more cloying, as though its purpose was not to please but to hide. Those who caught it near their own homes turned their heads quickly, muttering about his eccentric habits, unwilling to connect the fragrance to the absence of their kin. Inside his shuttered rooms, the truth was gathering. The cold had turned his craft into a problem of storage, and Vane was nothing if not practical in his rituals. What he could not release to the river he kept. Not as trophies, he had no need for that kind of sentiment, but as materials awaiting their purpose. The bodies were arranged in the farthest corners of his cellar, where the frost crept in through the stone and kept them rigid, pale, and quiet. Each was wrapped in linen to keep the skin from cracking, each marked in a way only he understood. A cut of thread here, a thin stripe of ink across a wrist there. Notes in his private language of preparation. The smell, even under linen and frost, was stubborn. He worked in the night, layering the perfume into the air, into the cloth of his own coat, into the very wood of the cellar steps, until the sweetness was everywhere, smothering the metallic truth beneath. To him, the scent was not concealment, but a kind of seal, an olfactory lock on a room the world was not meant to enter. It pleased him to think that when people smelled it in the street, they thought only of him, not of what he had done. The river's absence forced a change in his rhythm. There was no relief in disposal, no clean severance between one act and the next. Instead, the cellar became a museum of unfinished works, each waiting for the thaw. The cold preserved them, but it also slowed him, forcing him to linger over what he would normally release. He came to see it as an opportunity, a deepening of his art. Without the rush to be rid of them, he could study the quiet shapes of their stillness. The way the frost traced lacework across skin, the way a frozen eyelash caught the lantern light. These were not obstacles, but moments to be captured in memory. Outside, the snow kept falling. Belhaven sank into a kind of suspended life, each family curled inward, against the cold, each disappearance folded into the silence of survival. The river lay unmoving, its glassy surface hiding nothing because there was nothing beneath it, nothing yet. Vane knew the thaw would come, and when it did, the water would once again carry away the weight he had kept. Until then, the perfume would hang in the air like a promise, sweet and suffocating, marking the days until the ice broke and the current returned to its work. The snow had begun to thin in places, revealing the blackened earth beneath, but the air still carried the sharp taste of winter. Belhaven was restless in its thaw. People were counting the missing now, whispering names as though speaking them aloud too clearly would make the truth harder to bear. Among these names was Samuel Brandt, a boy of 9 years with hair the color of straw and a habit of wandering the edge of the river when it was not yet safe to walk upon it. He vanished on a morning that began like any other, the frost clinging to the panes, the chimney smoke hanging low. The Brant family's door left ajar as if he had only stepped out for a moment. By nightfall, searchers had scoured the banks, the woods, and the narrow lanes. They found nothing but the echo of his name in the cold. In Vane's study, the ledger lay open on his desk, its pages thin and brittle as old skin. Every entry was written in the same careful hand, each name paired with a date and a small mark, a private cipher of meaning known only to him. Some marks were circles, some crosses, some lines that curved into shapes half remembered from older scripts. But beside Samuel Brant's name was something different, a spiral drawn so tightly it seemed to pull the ink inward, ending in a single arrow. Vane's fingers lingered on it as though it were not just a record but a seal, a binding. This mark was rare. It meant finality. It meant the closing of a design years in the making. Vane's mind was not troubled by the boy's age or innocence. Those were irrelevant measures to him. Samuel was not a child in his eyes, but a position in a sequence. A shape that would complete a pattern he had been building quietly and without witness. Every mark in the ledger was part of that pattern, a web that to the untrained eye would look like scattered deaths, but to Vane was a geometry of intent. Samuel's spiral and arrow was the last line in the structure, the keystone in an arch no one else knew existed. To leave it incomplete would be to let the entire design collapse into nothing. He kept the ledger near him for days, tracing the ink with the tip of his nail, reviewing the pages as though they were scripture. The earlier names still carried their weight, each life chosen, taken, placed exactly where it belonged in the order. The spiral symbol was not invented on a whim. It was the oldest in his repertoire, borrowed from an age before Belhaven existed, before the river had a name. To Vane, the spiral was the path inward, the arrow the inevitable end. Samuel's place in the sequence was not about his life, but about the resonance his death would carry through the rest, the unseen ripple that would settle the entire design into harmony. The town's search for the boy bled into its other fears, each disappearance now tangled with the others. People spoke in doorways and lowered their voices when Vane passed, though none dared accuse him outright. His perfume seemed thicker than ever, the sweetness drifting into the lanes hours before he appeared. It clung to the corners where children once played, to the fence posts along the Brant property, to the very air by the frozen river. To some it was just his strange habit. To others it was a shadow without a shape, a warning they could not put into words. Vane waited. The thaw was coming, and with it the means to place Samuel exactly where he was meant to be. Until then the boy was held in a place only Vane knew, his small form preserved not out of mercy but out of necessity. The spiral in the ledger was already closed, the arrow already drawn. The act itself was inevitable, a note yet to be struck in the song only he could hear, the one he had been writing in the silence of Belhaven for years. When the river broke and the current returned, the design would be complete, and no one in the town would ever know the shape of the thing that had been built around them. The night the mob came, the air was thick with the wet smell of melting snow and the sour breath of too many bodies pressed close in fear. They moved as one down the narrow lane toward the morgue, not with courage but with the grim knowledge that something inside had to be seen to be believed. The doors gave under their weight with a dull crack, letting out a gust of cold, stale air that clung to their skin like a living thing. The dim lamplight inside caught on metal, on glass, on the pale glisten of what lay waiting in the walls. The drawers were not built for beauty, yet there was something deliberate in their arrangement, each handle polished, each label written in the same meticulous hand. One by one, the drawers slid open, the sound low and steady like the turning of a wheel deep underground. Inside there were no whole bodies, only parts, preserved with an elegance so at odds with the brutality that had taken them. Fingers floated in amber liquid, knuckles curled as though still holding something unseen. Eyes stared from behind the glass, their clouded irises forever fixed on a point far beyond the room. There were hearts, pale and suspended, each one cradled in an ornate jar etched with thin curling lines, the patterns too precise to be decorative. Every piece had a place, a purpose, and the precision made the scene worse. It was not a collection of horrors, but an arrangement. Some jars bore names, the handwriting careful and formal, as though recording something noble. Others carried only dates, and those who saw them could not help but notice that some dates had not yet come to pass. The future victims had already been chosen. Their absence was already written in the quiet ink of Vane's order. The mob's whispers turned into shallow, uneven breaths as they realized that the morgue was not a resting place but a workroom, and they were standing inside the heart of a design that had been in motion for longer than any of them had suspected. It was not rage that held them there, but the weight of knowing they were inside someone else's mind, a place built not with walls, but with years of methodical thought. The jars were arranged on the shelves like the sections of an orchestra, each type of part grouped together, each label like a note in a score. If the pieces were instruments, then Vane was the composer and Belhaven had been listening to his silent symphony without hearing it. The realization settled over them like frost that even the dead were not truly gone here, only waiting for their moment in the composition. Outside, the river was beginning to groan under the thaw, the ice shifting in slow, deep cracks. Inside, the drawers gaped open, their contents glistening under the lamplight, and the mob found no words to close them. The air felt heavy, almost tuned, as if the room itself was holding its breath for a final note none of them could bear to hear. The courtroom had been prepared for a spectacle, but Vane denied them the theater they expected. He sat in the dock like a figure carved from something cold and dense, hands folded loosely, head inclined just enough to suggest he was listening, though his gaze never followed the voices. The townspeople who had braved the sight of him waited for some outburst, some crack in his composure, yet what they saw instead was the absence of any need to defend himself. It was as though the trial were not about him at all, but about a misunderstanding he was allowing others to have. Witness after witness spoke of missing sons and vanished wives, of the smell that followed him through the streets, of the ledger found in his home with its strange symbols and unbroken order. But Vane did not speak, not once. His stillness was not defiance. It was something colder, a belief that their words were too far below the truth to merit reply. It was on the fourth morning of proceedings that the judge arrived to find a small package waiting on his bench, the brown paper tied with a black silk ribbon. No one had seen it delivered. Inside, cushioned in folded cloth, was a glass vial filled with a pale golden liquid. Its fragrance spread quickly through the stale air of the chamber. Sweet at first, then cloying, then something else beneath, something that clung to the throat and would not wash away. Some in the gallery coughed and turned their faces, but the judge held the vial a moment longer before setting it down. Beneath it was a folded page torn from the same ledger they had seen in evidence. In the precise, even hand that had labeled the jars in the morgue, the page bore only a single name, the judge's own, followed by a date 3 years into the future. Next to the date was a mark none present had yet seen in the book. A narrow downward spiral ending in a small, deliberate point. The judge read it without changing expression, but those close enough saw his knuckles pale as he set the paper aside. Vane watched him from across the room, his eyes calm, unblinking, the faintest suggestion of satisfaction in the stillness of his mouth. There was no explanation enclosed, no plea for mercy, no denial. The message was complete in itself. It was the purest form of confession. Not an admission of guilt, but a statement that guilt was irrelevant when the act was part of a design. Vane did not see death as punishment or as consequence. He saw it as craft, a work whose worth could not be measured by the tools used to make it, but only by the perfection of its arrangement. Those who studied him in those days began to understand that he did not keep his victims out of impulse or hunger. He kept them as a sculptor keeps shapes in clay, each one a fragment of a whole not yet seen. The jars, the ledger, the symbols. These were not trophies, but notes in a composition that spanned years. In his mind, the judge's date was already fixed into place, just as the names before it had been. It was not a threat. It was a truth that needed no violence in the present to give it weight. The court, the sentence, even the gallows could not break the quiet certainty of a man whose work extended beyond his own life. In the evenings, when the guards led him back to his cell, the corridors filled with the faint trace of that perfume, as if it seeped from his skin. Some swore it lingered even after he was gone, a scent that was not merely masking something foul but carrying it, binding it into sweetness so that it could not be refused. Those who had been in the courtroom when the vial was opened found themselves waking in the night with its aroma still in their lungs, as if they too had been marked by it. When the trial closed and the sentence was read, Vane did not move. The verdict of death meant nothing to him because his design was not bound to the court's clock. Somewhere in his thoughts, the spiral and the date remained untouched, the future already written in the same hand that had mapped so many others. The judge, for all his authority, would leave the courthouse carrying the knowledge that 3 years hence, by a logic no one else could see, his place in the arrangement would come due. It was the kind of truth that could not be disbelieved once it was known, and Vane had given it without a word. The day the guards led him away for the last time, the perfume still hung in the air of the courtroom, faint but undeniable. It was not the scent of flowers or oils, but the ghost of all that had been transformed by his hands, preserved into beauty against its will. In the silence he left behind, the townspeople found no comfort, only the uneasy sense that the work was unfinished, and that the man who had shaped it had simply stepped into another part of the design, one they could not yet see. The spiral was still turning. In the months after Vane's execution, Belhaven tried to bury the memory of him under a tide of official decrees and forced cheer. Yet the air itself seemed unwilling to forget. The scent, that peculiar sweetness that once drifted from the morgue, would surface without warning, curling through the narrow streets on windless days, lingering in the spaces between breaths. It became an unspoken superstition, a presence that could not be named in polite company. The town council, under pressure from families who could no longer sleep without dreams of sealed jars and silent drawers, drafted what became known as the Perfume Law. It forbade the making, sale, or possession of certain compounds, the ones most resembling the formula found in the vial sent to the judge. Merchants were ordered to burn their stock, chemists to close their books, and apothecaries to scrub their shelves with lye. The law was not about safety. It was about purging a ghost from the air. The place where the morgue once stood was reduced to a square of flattened earth, the building demolished within days of the trial's end. In its place, the council erected a small memorial, a stone pillar with no names, no inscriptions, just the faint outline of a spiral etched into its base. At its unveiling, the mayor spoke of closure and cleansing. Yet no one lingered to admire the work. By the following winter, weeds had taken root along its edges, their stalks rattling like bones in the wind. Children were warned not to play there. Adults found reasons to cross the street before they reached it. And after dusk, the square was left to the shadows, for those who passed claimed the air there was never still, that something unseen shifted in the dark as if the earth itself was breathing. The ledger, the heart of Vane's private order, remained sealed in the county vault, wrapped in oilcloth and locked within a chest that required 2 keys kept by different hands. Officially, it was evidence. Unofficially, it was a map of deaths yet to come. Those who had handled it during the trial swore the ink on certain pages was not yet faded, as if the entries had been written only yesterday, though the names belonged to people who had not yet been born. The symbols beside them, spirals, half-moons, jagged marks like fractured glass, defied translation. Some claimed to have traced patterns between the older entries and the events of the last decade, as though the ledger had been less a record than a prediction, each date arriving with the certainty of a clock striking the hour. In time, the Perfume Law spread beyond Belhaven, adopted by neighboring towns and then by the county itself, until the very ingredients once common in perfumes and tonics became contraband. The authorities claimed it was to prevent poisonings, but the people knew better. They understood that the law was not a wall against harm, but a charm against something that could not be killed with rope or fire. They feared that the scent, like the ledger, might still be out there, a thread in a design too large for them to see, one that did not end with the man they hanged. Even now, on certain nights when the river mist creeps low across the streets, the faint perfume drifts again, carrying with it the suggestion of names unwritten and lives already measured. The memorial stands alone in the square, untouched except by the wind, the spiral at its base slowly wearing away beneath the rain. And in the vault, beneath layers of lock and stone, the ledger waits, its pages undisturbed, its dates untouched by time, as if holding its breath until the hour comes when its work may resume. It would have been easier for Belhaven to believe that Vane's work was born of some supernatural curse, an unholy force whispered into his ear by something not of this world. But the truth was quieter, more terrible. His hands were not guided by shadows, they were guided by patience. His mind did not wander into madness, it walked in a straight line. Every act, every detail, every jar on every shelf was the result of decisions made without the weight of human feeling. There was no storm inside him, no fever, no divine madness to excuse the things he did. There was only a man who knew what he wanted and understood the simplest truth about the human body: that it was fragile, that it could be taken apart if one had the time, the tools, and the will to do so. Vane had been the kind of man no one noticed twice in the street. He carried himself with an unhurried calm, spoke in tones that never rose or fell, and remembered the names of shopkeepers' children. People recalled how he would offer a handkerchief to someone coughing in the market, or pause to pick up a dropped coin for an old woman. It was this quiet civility that allowed him to disappear in plain sight. The evil that lived in him was not the kind that drips from a twisted smile or flashes in an unhinged eye. It was the kind that understands the comfort of trust, and how to build it so thoroughly that no one questions when you ask them to follow you into a room, to sit in a chair, to close their eyes. His patience was its own weapon. He could wait years for the right moment to take what he wanted. He could smile at someone while knowing they were already his, their name already marked, their absence already planned for. He recorded these decisions in his ledger not as conquests but as certainties, each date a quiet promise to himself. There was no thrill in the taking, no surge of excitement, no desperate need. The act was simply the completion of a task he had already done in his mind. The world thought monsters needed heat. In their blood, that cruelty was born of rage or hunger. Vane knew otherwise. True cruelty required the absence of those things. After his death, the question that haunted Belhaven was not how he had done what he did, but why no one had seen him for what he was. The answer lay in the truth no one wished to face: that people mistake gentleness for goodness and politeness for virtue. They expect evil to be loud, ugly, and obvious because that makes it easier to believe they will see it coming. But evil, like Vane's, did not announce itself. It smiled from across the table, poured you tea, and asked after your health. It wore the same face when it planned your end as it did when it wished you good night. Those who studied his methods, the ones who pored over the ledger, examined the preserved remains, traced his movements through years of unremarkable living, agreed on one thing. Vane's genius, if it could be called that, was in his refusal to rush. He did not take risks. He did not grow careless, and he did not allow desire to bend his timeline. His work was less like murder and more like gardening. He planted the seed of an idea, tended it unseen, and harvested when the season was right. No more, no less. It was not magic that made him dangerous, nor was it the tools in his hands. It was the simple fact that he saw human lives as objects on a shelf, each to be moved, altered, or discarded as he pleased. In the years after his execution, Belhaven learned to live with the knowledge that there was nothing supernatural to blame, no ancient curse to lift. There had only been a man, and men can be anywhere. The townspeople began to watch strangers more closely, but also, uneasily, the familiar faces they had known all their lives. For if Vane had taught them anything, it was that evil does not always enter with a roar. Sometimes it walks beside you, offers you its coat in the rain, and listens patiently as you speak. Sometimes it waits until you are certain you are safe before it opens the door you never saw coming. And when it smiles, it is not to comfort, but to conceal the fact that it has already chosen the day you will be gone.